The material that you're about to listen to and engage with came from our 2017 Missiology Lectures, when myself, along with my colleague Johnny Ramirez-Johnson, said we need to do this next 2017 Missiology Lectures on this topic of race, theology, and mission. And we invited Dr. Love Seacrest to engage with us in that process. We wanted to explore the challenging questions regarding racism and ethnocentrism and xenophobia and all of those issues from the perspective of world Christianity with regard to how these realities have existed in many parts of the world, and also as part of the colonial mission endeavors.
It is fascinating to think that the realities we were talking about are not the experiences of one individual or even one society. We're talking about whiteness as a way of defining the world. And the conference and the conference presenters address time and again this epistemology, this way of making meaning. It has also been described as colonization and post-colonization. The question is not about guilt, it's about engagement. It's about what are we going to do with what we have inherited. So the fact that we're having the conversation should not point a finger at you as a listener or viewer.
But these are hard conversations. The conversation about race is one that has been deferred for so long and so often, over and over again. As soon as we get close to having a meaningful conversation about race, we recoil from the pain of it. And so in our lectures, you'll see some of that pain emerge. You'll see some people who have long experienced racism express and declare and name experiences that they have had that have been deeply formative, deformative even. So this conversation is not a pretty one, but we're having it.
As observers, as listeners, you will be engaging, and we invite you to invite the Holy Spirit. The three of us pray a lot about this series. We humbly submitted to God and pleaded for God's mercy to lead us. We are feeble, and combined, we are imperfect, and we have prayed that the Lord will fill the gaps. And the conversation is only a starter. It is in your hands. It is in your community. It is in your family. And most importantly, it is on your knees. Dr. Tran, you should have the first opportunity to respond and to say what you like to say.
I told you he's trenchant. So three things. I think that sounds that all sounds right. So three things. One, I usually worry about the move where we say, well, when the response to the critique of Asian American life is to kind of shift the target. Because you're right, we do need to specify what we mean. But there's a way that move is made that feels that could be, and I'm not saying this is what you're doing, but there's a way that move can be made that is evasive. And it's one thing to say that not all Asian Americans have privilege, but it's another thing to use that same move to escape complicity. So that's what I'm pressing towards. But you're absolutely right. And I tried to qualify that the model minority myth is wrong insofar as it presumes that Asian Americans have accomplished what they have without denigrating or at the cost of others. But it's also wrong, absolutely, as you said, in the sense that there is a whole history, and the entire history of Asian American presence in America has been one of ongoing systematic and explicit racism and terror. So, but I worry about how to think about this move, because it is right to say, well, not all Asian Americans are such and such. But I'm worried that move sometimes is a move away from acknowledging complicity. The second thing is I wouldn't want to say that vacating your Harvard slot is passive or that it's a kind of quietism. In fact, I think it's an amazing move of political gesture and a highly visible one. It's also the case that none of that precludes participating in justice, unless we want to say that you need to go to Harvard to participate in justice. There are ways in which I worry about my own lecture insofar as it suggests that there's something special about Harvard, as if Harvard itself hasn't been complicit in these systems. But there's nothing to say that not going to Harvard, that means you give up your commitment and work in an active way for justice. I would want to say that is an act of justice in itself, and a very political, visible one, but it also does not preclude participation in other modes of activity. But those are just some initial thoughts.
Anything you'd like to respond, Dr. Lee?
Yeah, my comments, even though I got overexcited, is the compliment, right? Because, I mean, that privilege is there. And I think trying to navigate the black and white, binary paradigm, which is important. I think that's the complication. It's important, and it'll continue on. And that Asian Americans have privilege in some sense, right? But to navigate this thing is the struggle of Asian Americans. But I think what I press for is that we understand the dynamic correctly, right? And we understand why it's problematic, why we are Asian Americans are people of color, why we are, in some sense, that language erases us. To understand that, and then trying to figure out what the situation is. I mean, I'm a person of color, but do I get shot by the police? It just doesn't happen that way, right? But it turns out that if you're dark enough as an Indian American, you can get shot. Like you are dark enough. So in that sense, I worry about that. How do we make sure that when we say Asian Americans, because I have to include that person, otherwise Indian American, there's no place to go. They're not black, they're not Hispanic, they're nothing, right? But they're supposed to fall into the Asian American space. So I need to figure out a way to include that in the conversation that we have. Because once again, I'm the professional Asian American, and this is a space where they're supposed to be included. But if they don't get included, then they're not included at all. So that's basically what I worry about.
Well, what if I qualify what I said to say that Asian American Christians, instead of saying Asian American Christians should give up their Harvard spot, I can qualify it by saying Asian American Christians who recognize their privilege helped them to get into Harvard, give up their Harvard spot. So in other words, there's a moment of agency in recognizing privilege. So if your primary concern is that it's not always privilege that gets them to Harvard, and so it makes not a lot of sense to relinquish that, then how about those in a position who are able to recognize privilege, look for ways to divest themselves of that? So
yeah, as long as they're actually doing activism as well. I just
don't know why you would say as well. That seems like
I'm sorry. Yeah. That's the activism actually is broader as
absolutely.
Well, right? Because that's activism.
I would imagine someone that is that fluent in recognizing what they would do would be continuous with the whole life. I mean, I can't imagine someone doing something that powerful without already being steeped in the discourses that you rightly brought up.
Yeah.
Very much interesting. And let me, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, should I say something about my going to Harvard? But I think I should not say anything. Instead, I will read this question. Given the complex forces of the past, what practical step would institutions like Harvard need to take in order to deconstruct their own constellation of power and privilege? Dr. Tran.
Could you read the question again?
Yes. What should Harvard do to avoid having this issue of minorities and putting them one against the other, in other words?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that Harvard knows how to imagine racial life without kind of pitting games of minority on minority violence. That's kind of my point, is that on the one hand, it's a gesture, their affirmative action strategy is a gesture, but it's extremely limited. And And so what I'm trying to do is to remove the agency of consideration away from Harvard to make that move, because I just don't know that higher ed has a sense of how to do this. I mean, it's not that Harvard is struggling. I mean, I come from Baylor University. My alma mater, Duke University, has been in the news. So I don't know that anyone is doing particularly well with this. So I'm trying to reimagine where moral agency is taken. I think it's unfortunate that the way some Asian Americans have responded to the Harvard systematic discrimination is simply some version of, well, we need to get ours. And there needs to be some other kind of agency, some kind of other kind of expression of what it means to be Asian American, other than to, as some have lined up in the lawsuit.
Well,
But in terms of practical things, I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which the way funding works, the way tenure lines work, the ways committees on universities are constituted, the way discourses are allowed to integrate across university fields. So there's all kinds of things universities are doing. And I would say that of universities, Harvard seems to be extremely interested, at least in terms of their visible presentation in these questions. Now, I'm sure if you poll someone from Harvard that's on the faculty or a student, they're going to give you a kind of different witness, a different report on that. But at least on the face of it, that's what this affirmative action case seems to be saying, which is something like, we think affirmative action is important for this reason, at least in my imagined version of what they're doing. And so how do we think about that? What do we think is going on? And so I think in the same way that Professor Lee was saying that Asian Americans are something of a test case on diversity, I want to extend that. I think that's exactly right, and say that Asian Americans around the issue of affirmative action really test this issue. That's why this is such an interesting moment in this history.
a second question here from those that write with pen. How can we begin to reframe the conversation about race and ethnicity within Christian mission so that our terminology reflects a more accurate, just reality? So how can we give the church better language and better categories?
Well, one of the things I want to say is this: we always have to think in two different ways. We have to think in terms of how we encounter each other, like just the interpersonal, existential way of thinking about ourselves and diversity, as well as, in a different way, structural, historic trajectories of what that is. And we have to distinguish them. The reason, let me tell you a slow story. So I've been talking to some folks in university who are interested in biracial students, because there's a lot within the university. And the question was, well, some biracial people would say, well, I really am, like black and white. And I say, well, it's good. You feel that way, and you might be connected in different ways, but there's a broader trajectory historically and structurally and how outside see you that you're just black. You have to understand both. And I think it's important to have both, because that experience of being both white and black is important in terms of how this person navigates it. But if they think, well, like let's say this person is black and white, but they're very, very light-skinned, and they don't understand the privilege of being light-skinned because they're forgetting the structural dimensions of it, then let's say they go around talking about how they're black as well. That becomes problematic, right? So I think when we talk about church and talking about missions, how do we always keep that in mind? How do we think about how do we love each other, love your neighbor, see each other, all that's all important. But if we forget the structural dimensions of what's happening, historic dimensions, then we just become complicit. We talk about loving each other while supporting, policies and laws and even institutional structures that are just there. And we think it's going to be solved by relationships. And sometimes it just won't be solved that way, because that's not what the problem is. At Fuller, for example, I think so many, well, maybe I shouldn't talk about this. When I encounter people, it's not personal racism, right? Very little. But the question is, how aware is everybody in terms of the structural white normativity, right? What's considered normal, regular theology And then you have that 1 week. You gotta include it because diversity is important. So you have the weird theology. Now, what's the power dynamic of that, right? That's what we're talking about. Personally, I've met so many. I mean, I don't face that kind of racism at Fuller. Now, sometimes I forget what's happening around the world and around the country. But if I forget that, if I forget what's happening structurally and what exists here structurally, I think I'm gonna miss the boat, and I'm gonna miss what I need to do in terms of my mission. So that's how I think individuals and churches have to think about it. Always two different ways, right? What's happening, relationships, your understanding of yourself, and then what's happening broader structurally, right? And how you address that? Two different things. It can't be just fixed for all that way, right?
I mean, this is a fantastic question, and to me, maybe one of the $1 million questions. We currently lack the conceptual language to describe who we are in relationship to one another, even to ourselves. It is the nature of language to do two kinds of things. One, to ride roughshod over particularity. Yes. That's Daniel's point about the moniker Asian American. The reality is that Asian American, at least say for my life at Baylor and your life at Fuller, gives you currency in a space. But at the same time as it gives you a space to live, it also rides roughshod over your particularity. This is the delimitation, a necessary feature of language. That's how we share common lives together. It's an amazingly violent reality. It's also the nature of language to adapt itself to new contingent realities. And I think that Daniel's point about the relational context may be the context out of which new conventions of speech allow us to move forward. My thinking of race at this point is to be at places like this, as well as in my own location at Baylor, and to think, what are people doing and how are people speaking about race? And are we moving the conversation forward with new available concepts? I take it that Professor Jennings, The Christian Imagination, why that is such a phenomenally important text is both the analysis of the way language does ride roughshod over local communities, but also his attempt to give witness to newly emerging contexts within missionary contexts specifically that arise or put pressure on previous ways of thinking about it. So that's what I'm really interested in is what are the new conceptual tools available to us? Because without those, then we're just in the roughshod context.